All right, welcome to our second week of our class on Beginner's Guide to the Bible, where we kick off the year. If you remember last week, we talked a little bit about the kind of history behind the Bible. I'll recap a little bit of that today, but today we're going to jump into the question, what does the Bible say? What's actually in the Bible? What's the Bible about? Does it tell a story or something like that? So we'll see. And I'll open this in prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for this time you set aside for us to study, to ponder, to read your word. We pray that you would meet us there. Pray that you would be with us in all of our reading and all of our thinking. Be with us here. Be with us as we go out in the world. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear you at work in these ancient texts, but also in the world around us. Amen. All right, so last week we talked about the question, what is the Bible? What is this thing? And that we tend to think about it as a book on a shelf that sort of got to our hands, kind of like other books on the shelf that might be next to them, like Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. That this book sitting there on the shelf was published by someone in a certain time. It was written from cover to cover by someone, maybe had an editor or two. But we talked about how this thing is actually quite different from any other book that you might find on the bookshelf at your store. In fact, this very invention of the book, that is to say the codex, this form of binding things together, exists in our world today because of the Bible. But the Bible predates this form of this technology, really, of publishing. And it was invented precisely because the Bible was so big and was so complicated that there were these scrolls. That was a more common way in the sort of biblical period to write things down, was to write things down on these big, long parchment or leather scrolls. And they would roll them up. There's 66 books in our Bible, but there's other amounts of books in other canons, other groups of Bibles. So the Catholic canon has more books than the Protestant canon does. The Greek Orthodox canon has more books than that. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has way more books than any of those. And those are still Bibles. But when you go to the bookstore, you might find a kind of a Catholic Bible and a Protestant Bible here in the United States. But just to say the Bible's always been more complicated than that. So what is the Bible? It's a library. It's a library of books. It's a library of books that somebody, or some group of people, has put together and collected and bound together. And that only really started in the 3rd century AD, to select these books and come up with a table of contents and to bind them together. And some of the earliest bound Bibles have books that you might not have heard of, like the Shepherd of Hermas. Is in some of those early Bibles. So that is to say that the church took a long time to figure out what exactly was going to be in or out of any particular Bible. The first church council, the earliest church council that made any decision officially about what was in or out of the Bible, was in the 1500s. It was the Council of Trent in the 1590s. So all to say, the Bible took a long time to form. It was written by many different people over many different centuries. So we talked about how there's really it's a metaphor. We can think of 3 different metaphors of ways to approach this question: what's in the Bible, or what does the Bible say? And then we can think of this book, or any book really, but the Bible is a great example of this, as like a window into a world behind it, a window into a past world. We might call this the world behind the text. And you can do this with any book. You can look at Les Miserables and ask those questions: what was going on in the life of Victor Hugo? What was going on in France? What was going on in Paris, in the 1860s? What about the kind of after effects of the French Revolution? You can ask about Napoleon. You can ask all these different questions that would help you understand that text. But in a way, you'd be really asking questions about the history behind the text. You can do this with pretty much any ancient or modern literature. If you pick up a history of the Civil War, and you open it up and start to read it, you can ask questions about what it says about the Civil War, but you can also ask questions about what it says about the time period and the context of the author who wrote it. My guess is that if you read a history of the Civil War, and then you picked up another one and read a history that were quite different, written by different people, you could probably pick out what kind of person wrote that. Maybe when they wrote that, maybe where they were when they wrote it, maybe how they grew up. You might be able to suss that out, right? Well, you can do that with all sorts of texts, all sorts of ancient texts, too. So when we look at the world behind the text of the Bible, we could be asking what was going on at the kind of the level of the narrative. You can ask questions about, like, you read the story of Luke's gospel. We can ask about the Jesus like this picture, this window onto Jesus that Luke's gospel presents, we can also ask the question about the author Luke. This person wrote this story in a specific, particular way. What does that tell us about that person's context, about that person's life? In the same way that if you read a history of the Civil War written in the 1920s, written in Mississippi, it'd be very different from reading a history of the Civil War written in 2023 by someone who lives in Germany, right? You get a very different sense of flavor, right? So you can do that with these ancient texts that make up the Bible as well. Who wrote these and when? That's often an open question because in the ancient world, they didn't sign their documents. I wrote this, especially literary documents. They didn't really sign these things. So this window behind this kind of world behind the text, thinking of the text as a window to the past. That's one way to think about the Bible. Another way to think about it is almost like a painting, like you're looking at a work of art. So you stop asking for a moment about the world behind the text, like the history behind it, and you start just thinking about how it works. So like, if you look at it like Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, stop asking questions about like, what was actually happening in Paris in 1862? Did these people make this barricade in this exact spot? Who was General Lamarck? Did he really die? Whatever. You can stop asking about that and kind of not care for a moment. And instead ask, what about these characters? Right? Jean Valjean, how is he characterized? Right? What kind of speeches does he make? Right? What are the themes in this text as Hugo has written it? Let's talk about the theme of justice in this text. Right? So that is to say, you can ask those questions about the work of art itself, almost like looking at a painting. If you look at Starry Night, you might say to yourself, what did Vincent Van Gogh have for breakfast that morning? Or what was he trying to say about the world? What were the historical events that led him to make this painting? You can ask those questions. It might be more useful to ask the question like, what does this make me feel? Right? Take a look at the color, the composition, the shape. Right? You can ask those questions too. Those are questions about that world in the painting or the world in the text as a work of art itself. And there's a third way to think about anything, any cultural artifact, any story, any movie, whatever, but thinking about this as a reflection, really thinking, what does this mean to me or for my time? What is this telling me to do? What is this telling me to think? What is this telling me to believe? So we can ask that question about Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. We can say, what is this story telling me about justice? We can ask that question kind of in the text. What does the text have to say? What are the themes of justice here? Right? And truth and righteousness and forgiveness, grace. Right? Those are all big themes in Hugo's work. We can also ask, what is this thing telling me about that? What does this matter to my life? When I read about the bishop giving the candlesticks to Jean Valjean, is that telling me? How do I live that? Or when Javert jumps off the bridge because he can't possibly live in a world that doesn't have total justice. What does that mean for me? What does that do to my life? What does it do to the way I think about our justice system, right? Okay, all those things are big questions that I would say is kind of like almost like a mirror. The text reflects me back to us. And these are three very different kinds of questions to ask. What about that world behind the text? What about that world in the text? What about that world in front of the text? And I think it really helps for us to ask these questions of the Bible. And it helps us to differentiate them, right? There are three completely different things to ask. So, today we're going to talk about the scrolls, the ta biblia, which is just the Greek word that means like basically the library. So we're reading, this is a library of different books written at different points in time by different people in different languages that reflect very different social circumstances. So it's almost like putting Les Miserables next to, like The Hunt for Red October. So, they're completely different books written in completely different times. Now, those are, it's better than Hunt for October, but just imagine how different those are, right? So some of the stuff, right, the earliest stuff we've got in the Bible written sometime around 1200 BC. The latest stuff written in the Bible written sometime around the year 180. So that's 1,300 years of difference between the early stuff and things have changed a lot in the last 2 years. Shakespeare is closer to us than that. So just think about how much things have changed in terms of how people talk, right? What they take for granted in terms of what people would know, right? So all to say, we got to think a little carefully about how to read these things. So these scrolls, and when were they written? Like I said, sometime 1200 BC to 1000 BC is kind of the earliest stuff. But the Old Testament, last bits were written in 167 BC, written in the summer of 167, we actually date it almost to the day, when the last thing was written in the Old Testament. And then the New Testament, the first thing written is 1 Thessalonians. That's the earliest writing that's in the New Testament, written by Paul and Silas and Timothy, and written in Silvanus, written to the church in Thessaloniki. And they wrote that in about 49 AD. The last stuff for the Old Testament, New Testament, we don't really know, but sometime around the year 100 AD. So about 50 years is a window of New Testament. So the New Testament stuff is pretty similar. Although you get some people who wrote some stuff in the New Testament that are more familiar with Roman and Greek culture and come from that world. And you get people who are more familiar with Jewish culture and are more at home in that world. And they speak differently. Mark writes really differently from Luke. Luke is much more at home in the world of Greek historiography, Greek history writing. Mark is somebody who's just barely learned Greek because they want to express their story in a way that other people could understand it. So very different people, very different places, very different social locations, even within that 50 years. Okay, I gave some big ideas last time. I think this is like fundamental to how I understand the Bible. Now, we've often heard people say this thing is inerrant, it's kind of spoken, it's verbal inspiration. God spoke these words, someone wrote it down like they were dictated to, right? And they just kind of published it the way it is. The Bible doesn't actually talk about itself like that. The Bible uses the word inspired, but God breathed. But Paul claims all the things he wrote. He doesn't say, I'm listening to a voice, and the voice is telling me to write these things. He talks about himself and his own thinking process the entire time he's writing. He's like, I'm struggling with, Paul in Romans literally says, I'm struggling with these ideas. I don't quite understand what's happening. That's not God speaking, right? That's Paul giving you an honest opinion about his own struggle with how to understand Jesus. So that is to say, these books were clearly written by people at particular points in time. So my big idea is that God communicates with people in ways that they can understand. God's not speaking in some secret code. God's not speaking in ways that like someone wouldn't get for 1,000 years. So when we read prophets in the Old Testament, they're not talking about some event that would happen 2,000 years from then and that no one would understand until then. They're speaking to people in ways that they can understand about things that they could do something about. When we read Isaiah 7, and it gives the prophecy of Emmanuel, God will be with you. Isaiah is speaking to a bunch of people who are in the middle of a siege. Isaiah chapter 7 is very clear about this. It's a siege that's happening. They're about to die. There are two armies who are allied together against Jerusalem, and they are starving the people out. And Isaiah tells the king, God will be with us. Just wait. I don't think he was on the first level, at the first instance, speaking about something that's going to happen 1,000 years from now. The king, that doesn't matter to anyone there. The king is literally standing at the reservoir looking at the water that's drying up because they're under siege. They don't have enough water to survive. And Isaiah says, wait, don't worry, God is with us. When that's brought back up again in Matthew, his name shall be Emmanuel. His name was not Emmanuel. His name is Jesus. You know this. His name was Jesus. They did not name him Emmanuel. Did they disobey the angel? No. They weren't actually saying that was going to be his name. What they were saying was that prophecy that came true a long time ago when Isaiah said that God will be with you in a time of crisis. And God will be present with you. And at that moment in time, Isaiah said, there's a young woman. She's going to give birth, and her child will grow up and be healthy. In the middle of a siege, when you're about to die, if you say, this woman who's pregnant over here is about to give birth, and her child's going to be fine. 7, 8 years from now, her child's going to be happy. Imagine that child playing in the fields, eating curds and honey, nice food. Everything's going to be great. That's what that prophecy was about at the moment Isaiah said it. And in Matthew, when it's brought back up again, everyone says, I know that came true because Jerusalem survived that siege miraculously. And that message is now coming alive again in our own day. So this is my big claim, is that God speaks to people in ways they can understand about things they can do something about at that moment. And God doesn't speak over their heads. So that's why Genesis 1 is not written as a science textbook. It's about the creation of the world, but nobody would understand if it was about quarks and neutrinos and the Big Bang. So God spoke in a way that everyone would understand. God spoke in the language of ancient Near Eastern creation myths. It sounds a lot like every Egyptian creation myth we've heard. It sounds a lot like every Babylonian creation myth we've heard. They were all pretty similar. They lived in this big kind of cultural, sphere, right? Everyone kind of shared stories. So the Egyptian stuff sounds like the Mesopotamian stuff, sounds like the Canaanite stuff. It sounds like Israel's stories too, because they were an ancient Near Eastern people. So God speaks to these people in ways they can understand, using images they can understand, using metaphors they can understand, using specific pieces of language that they can understand, like in Hebrew. So people think in specific languages, specific cultural contexts, and the amazing thing about language, we can translate these languages between different groups of people. So ancient Israel was a part of this ancient Near Eastern culture. The stuff that made sense to people in ancient Babylon made sense to ancient Israel. Abraham and Sarah come from Babylon. They're Babylonian people. Everything they think about God comes from the Babylonian culture. Abraham and Sarah are not clear that there's just one God. They never say there is. Why? Because everyone in ancient Babylon believed there were lots of gods everywhere. What the God of the Bible asks of Abraham and Sarah is devotion, not intellectual acceptance of the idea that there's one and only ever one God and there's only been one God. Because God accepts that Abraham and Sarah come from a very thick, rich, deep culture, and God's not ultimately going to just drop a bomb of knowledge on them that's going to change everything they think about stuff, because then they would just not understand it. So God's working slowly with these folks, starting with what they understand and changing them over a long, slow period of time. And part of that is God accepts that we aren't right about a lot of stuff, and that's okay. We still aren't right about a lot of stuff, and that's okay. We hope that God works with us, too. So, if we understand this culture of ancient Israel, we can better understand the Bible, how God spoke to them, and maybe what God is still speaking to us today. Just like Mary and Joseph heard this name Emmanuel, and they understood, what happened back then in the year 734 in Jerusalem, BC. It's going to happen again. They understood the reference because they understood the culture. We've lost some of that cultural background, so this can really, really help us. Another big idea is that people wrote these scrolls. Paul wrote the letters of Paul, and Paul and his friends, right? He never claims that he wrote every word of every letter. In fact, he often claims that other people wrote with him. So Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy wrote 1 Thessalonians. But all Silas wrote some books. That is to say that Paul's a part of a team of people who are writing stuff, but they're human people. And instead of thinking that God dropped a shrink-wrapped Bible out of the sky and Paul published it or something, instead of we think the process was that God worked with these imperfect people who were, had human brains just like you and me and understood things in very limited ways and got stuff wrong sometimes. Nevertheless, God's committed to working with people who are limited and for people who are wrong. God's committed to doing that for the good of people over all time. So if we think about it that way, the biblical texts don't need to be perfect in the sense that, the book of Chronicles doesn't calculate a circle correctly because it doesn't know pi. The author doesn't know pi yet. Well, God didn't be like, I got to tell this person pi so that the Bible's perfect. No one knew pi back in ancient Babylon or ancient Israel, right? It hadn't been invented yet. So instead of skipping to make it perfect, or dropping some secret knowledge to make it perfect, God just said, okay, that's okay that they calculate a circle, with basically 3. It's instead of 3.14, they're going to multiply by 3 the diameter and get the right there. They're roundabout right. So roundabout right is what a lot of the Bible is. And in ethical terms too. That is to say, God accepted people who lived in a very specific ethical world. And God worked with those folks and did not need to change absolutely everything all at once. The Old Testament talks about slavery and endorses it. The Ten Commandments mention enslavement as a part of the Israelite culture. The laws of Moses talk about how to regulate slavery. There are some Christians who say, well, if the Bible's 100% accurate and there's no problems with it, and it mentions slavery, then slavery's got to be okay. There are a lot of other Christians who say, well, I'll just ignore that. I just won't talk about that. I won't think about that. Instead, I suggest that we think, okay, there's stuff in the laws of the Old Testament that's not necessarily good. What do we do about that? We're going to talk about that next week. But all to say is, just if we accept the idea that the Bible doesn't have to be ethically 100% perfect to align with our own ethical standards, because we aren't 100% ethically perfect, right? Our own ethical standards have problems. They're limited because we're limited human beings, and yet God works with us. So that is to say, we accept that ancient people were limited just like we are. One other thing to think about is, what kind of literature am I reading? People tend to think of the Bible as one type of literature. It's like God stuff, right? And this is all the God stuff, right? We can read, funny things over here. We can read, we can read beautiful poetry, and then we got the God stuff. This is the God stuff. It just kind of comes out of God's mouth. It's all the same thing. We just read it We read Kings exactly the same way as we read Romans, we read it exactly the same way as we read Genesis and Psalms. All the same kind of thing. In fact, if we look at ancient literature outside the Bible, like what the Egyptians wrote, what the Mesopotamians wrote, what the Canaanites wrote, there's tons of this stuff that's been published out there, done a bunch of stuff out of the ground, translated it, we got their literature. We know what kinds of things they wrote. We can compare the stuff in the Bible to the things we find out there in the real world. And we can say, okay, Song of Songs is love poetry. A very common thing in the ancient world was love poetry, and it got a little racy, just like love poetry today. And Song of Songs is love poetry. Okay, we read in the book of in Psalms, we read like lament songs, right? People were sad and expressed their sadness. Guess what? Ancient Israel's not the only people who do this. And when they express their sadness, it sounds an awful lot like the stuff we find here in the Bible. The sad stuff in the Bible sounds like emotions are cultural and right. So all of a sudden we can think, what kind of literature am I reading? Am I reading a sad poem? Am I reading a funny story? Jonah is a funny story. It's supposed to be funny, right? But we have to imagine when you watch a comedy from a different culture, it might be a little weird. You have to kind of get into it a little bit, right? What counts as funny over there, right? What counts as funny for me? So we have to think a little bit in terms of trying to what were the expectations of this piece of literature? So when someone read Genesis 1 in the ancient world, none of them thought, this is science. Because they did not have a genre of science. Science textbooks did not exist. They had some mathematical, kind of exercises that they did, but they did not have science like we have science. So they didn't have history like we have history. They didn't have tape recorders. They never assumed that a speech that someone gave would be recorded word for word and then put into a history book. You read ancient Greek literature where they're telling histories, like Thucydides, history, whatever, and he has these people give these big speeches. Guess what? They knew that they didn't say all those words, but what they're trying to do, the author was putting into particular words of a speech, like the content and important ideas that they knew would have been in that original speech. But they did not have tape recorders, no concept of them. They were not going to record word for word what anyone said, especially a speech that was done 100 years before that. So they expected this as part of their world, right? So when we think about genre, what genre, kind of thing am I reading, and what kind of cultural presuppositions go along with this? It can take us a long way to understanding stuff. So, what is this? What genre? Western. A Western. When you watch the Western, when you watch this movie, you aren't like, why aren't I laughing all the time? Where's the funny stuff, right? Why aren't they faulting, this isn't Three Stooges, right? So, if you watch this and expect it to be Three Stooges, you'll be disappointed, right? But then also, if you're aware of this genre, you can kind of pick up some cool stuff, these are all about the individual trying to define him or herself in the midst of a space of chaos. There's no rules yet. That's what the West is, right? No rules yet. There's no law yet, right? Everything is unformed, it's chaotic. How do you create order or survive in the midst of a chaotic system? That's what the Western is all about. We think about that, and we can understand what's going on in this Western a lot better, right? So we can think about that too in terms of the Bible. Okay, so that's my spiel about sort of the Bible as a window to this past. But what does it say then? How can we use some of that to help us kind of piece together, if there's some sort of overarching story to the Bible, right? What does the Bible actually say? What's the world in the text here? All right, we're going to have to do kind of quick. I don't know if you've seen it. The Bible's kind of big. It's hundreds of thousands of words, many, it's hundreds of thousands of pages right here. If you kind of lay them all out and don't use onion skin paper, this thing's huge. So all to say, I got to move quickly, but let me help you out a little bit here. I'm going to give you a skeleton kind of key. If there is a large narrative to the Bible, it's going to be something like what I'm going to present to you. So we're going to hop between books. One of the things I recommend about reading the Bible is that you have a Bible and that you kind of bring it places, and then also you mark it up, write on this thing. Some Christians get worried about writing on the Bible at sacred or something. Ancient biblical manuscripts, people wrote all over those things. You find that ancient biblical manuscripts, there's notes, there's interlinear stuff, there's explanations. People underline stuff, they put little dots next to important things, they highlighted stuff. I saw someone once get really mad about abbreviating the Xmas. Someone got really mad that someone wrote Xmas. Because it's Christmas, and you're taking Christ out of Christmas. And I was like, the whole Xmas thing comes from the earliest manuscripts we got of the Bible. Every single time Jesus' name, Christ came up, they put an X, because that's Christos. That is to say, they always abbreviated Jesus' name to an X, in the earliest manuscripts. And that's to say, if you look at how this, they did not treat this thing as sanitized, right? This was a working document for these ancient folks. So if it's a working document for you too, you can come back and be like, okay, I remember some stuff about Genesis 1 or whatever, even just like underlining some important stuff, so you can like flip through and be like, oh, this one, right? So this is my like skeleton key to the Bible. It starts in Genesis 1. Now, like I said, Genesis 1 is not a science textbook. It's not there to explain quarks and neutrinos to you. It is an ancient Near Eastern creation story. It is most similar to the Babylonian creation stories, the Canaanite creation stories, the Egyptian creation stories. We've got these. You can actually just Google them, Egyptian creation stories, and read them. And Ptah, the creator in ancient Egyptian mythology, creates by word, speaks the world into existence. You heard that, right? The Babylonian mythologies, right? They talk about how like human beings were created out of clay. Like the gods took mud and created the human, right? It's on Genesis 2, yeah. Right? This is the stuff in Genesis 1 and 2 sounds a lot like the folks around them, but there are some differences. For us to get the differences, we have to be a little bit familiar with what's around them. So, these ancient creation stories. One really important creation story from the ancient world that every Jew would have known was the Enuma Elish. This is the creation story of Babylon. It's really telling the story of how Babylon became superior in the world. Why are we so important? This is the story. They told it every New Year's Day. New Year's Day was always a celebration in every ancient Eastern culture where they told creation stories. New Year, creation stories. Right? New Year, new world, new creation. Right? So this was a big deal in the ancient world. They have a big party. And Jews who were taken in exile to Babylon had to listen to these. They had to show up, and they had to hear this story told to them. And the story went like this. Here we got, you got like a kind of image up there. This is a cylinder seal. You write these, you kind of smooth these out, roll this out to sign your name. This is someone's like name that they'd sign in a contract. Everyone would know each other's distinctive pictures. The big picture of a snake, right? And there's this like warrior god on top of them. The snake is the chaos monster. So every creation story from the ancient Near East starts with chaos. There was a chaos monster that was threatening the world. So the gods exist, right? Usually there's like kind of like a god before time, like Kronos and the Greek gods, and it has like a bunch of baby gods, and those baby gods sometimes have other baby gods. They're kind of all related like a family. And eventually there's some chaos monsters. And the chaos monsters try to fight and kill the gods. Usually this is because the chaos monsters are made to do all the work. They don't want to do all the work. In the ancient world, they thought gods had to eat. Gods still had to eat food like you and me. They had to breathe air, right? They thought that they were limited in those ways. Like, think about the Greek myths, right? The gods are limited in terms of ethics, knowledge. They don't know everything. They're not all powerful, right? So they need food. They still have to eat nectar and ambrosia from Zeus, right? So they have to eat in the ancient world. And the understanding was that they made the lesser gods serve the greater gods and farm and, produce food. And they got tired of this. And so those kind of lesser gods eventually revolt. And they turn chaotic. And they get a chaos monster to come help them. The chaos monster in Babylonian mythology is Tiamat. In Canaan, they had a story that there was a chaos monster named Leviathan. Have you heard of it? Yeah, this predates ancient Israel by 1,000 years. Stories of Leviathan. It was a chaos monster who threatened the order of the world. And the gods, the great gods, get together and fight to restore order. In ancient Canaan, it was Baal, the storm god. You heard Baal? Yeah. The story is that Baal, the storm god, kills the chaos monster and creates order. In Babylon, it was Marduk, the god of Babylon, who kills Tiamat, the chaos monster, and creates order. And here's you see all these images from everywhere in ancient Mesopotamia of this kind of monster fighting against a big guy with wings. That's a god fighting, that's Marduk, or Asher, the god of the Assyrians. Whoever your local god is the hero, is fighting against the chaos monsters. This idea is that the world is at base chaotic, and that it needs violence to instill order. If you're an ancient king, this story makes sense to you, because you need to kill some people to make those peasants farm for you. The idea, right, of these stories is that Tiamat, the rebellious, chaotic, lower-class god, fights against the high-class gods. The high-class gods get together and kill, they destroy this army and kill this chaos monster, and then cut up the chaos monster and create the world. So, after fighting Tiamat, Marduk, the god of Babylon, rested, and then he inspected Tiamat's corpse. He divided the monstrous shape and created marvels. He sliced her in half like a fish for drying. Half of her he put up to the roof of the sky. He drew a bolt across her and made a guard to hold him. He's building a sky. And then her waters he arranged so they could not escape. So basically they're making waters above They all thought the above us was water. You look up and it's, what color is it? It's blue, and there's water up there. They thought there was kind of like a big bowl or a big tent, like a big cellophane wrap above us that was holding out the water above, and they thought that there was waters below, and we were living in a big air bubble. That's what they thought, all these ancient people. They didn't know any better, it's okay. But they thought it was built on the carcass of a chaos monster. And so what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to farm. You're supposed to farm and then bring your food to the temple because you're taking the place of the chaos monsters. Right? But the point is that at the end of this story, Marduk or Baal, whoever, all these gods and all these different stories, take the body of the chaos monster and a little blood from a rebellious god, and they put it into clay and they form the humans. And they tell the humans, your job is to work now, and if you don't work, there's chaos. So your job as an ancient person is to go farm and bring your stuff to the temple. The temple is the palace of the god. So you bring your food that you've produced to the palace, or your oil, or your wine, to make the gods happy so that there's no chaos. Do you see how this is a story about you and the world and how it works, right? You have to don't rebel, right? Don't ask questions about why you're bringing stuff to the temple, because the gods need to eat, and you're the one who feeds them. Of course, the priests are the one, king is the one that eat the food, right? But this is the basis of tax collection in the ancient world. All right, so imagine you're one of these Jews who's taken in exile. You listen to this story every year, but then you go back, and at night, your own priests, they tell you a different story. They say, actually, this is the way it goes. In the beginning, there was just this kind of like void, but it didn't have a name. It wasn't a monster. And God started to create order out of this disorder. But there's no violence. There's no fighting. God just started to kind of build stuff. And God put a bowl. The firmament in Genesis 1 is literally a bowl. God turned the bowl. There was water, and God took the bowl, turned it upside down, put it down. If you take a bowl and put it down into water, what happens inside the bowl? Air bubble. We live in a giant air bubble. This is why in the Noah story, God pokes holes in the air bubble and the firmament, and the waters above come down. But then God plugs up the holes and drains the bottom. And, this is how they thought the world worked, right? And that's okay. Like, they weren't scientists, and neither am I. So, I didn't come up with a theory of how the world works. I just accept what I read in textbooks, right? So, all to say, they didn't do. So this idea of the world is God's creating the world, and God orders and structures the world, and there's no fight, there's no monsters. God does create sea monsters in Genesis 1, but those sea monsters are just made to play. And later on in the book of Job, God says, yeah, I made the sea monster Leviathan. It's pretty cool, isn't it? It just kind of goes around the ocean. In Psalm 74, Leviathan, I made it to play in the ocean. Anyway, all to say, God doesn't fight the chaos monsters. But God instead creates humans just to be cool and be the image of God. So imagine that message. Every single person you've ever met or you ever will meet is made in the image of God, is the presence of God in the world. They're not slaves taking the place of slave gods who rebelled. The other message is God doesn't need your food. God doesn't eat in the Old Testament. They say this over again. You don't bring your stuff to the temple because God eats it. God doesn't need your food. God doesn't need your food to create order. The order's in the world before you got here. In Genesis 1, it says, there are seeds, God made the fruit with seeds in it, so that you don't pray to make the crops grow. God built the world that way in Genesis 1. The world is built with order. The world is built so that you and every other human who's lived is supposed to be honored. Notice how different it is from the Babylonian message, that you are, by nature, a replacement slave. And at the end of the story, God ends up blessing these people, and God ends up saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill this earth. And then God finishes the work. So God created humankind, male and female. God created all the people who've ever lived, and God said, be fruitful and multiply. It's a blessing. All of life is a blessing. That's the counter message to the story of the chaos monsters. It's told in the same language, but it says a very different message. It's kind of like the Western that subverts the genre, right? You got to know the genre to get how it's subverting the genre. And so this creation story is out there to tell you something, right? So this story is really a story of blessing. The whole earth was created to be a blessing. It was created for you to be a blessing. And of course, as we know, there's problems with this. I'm going to skip that for a minute. But so we get another creation story. Genesis 2 is a different creation story. Things happen in a different order. God looks pretty different. God in Genesis 1 creates by word. It's not close. Genesis 2, God's a farmer. God's planting things. God takes the human being, forms out of clay, blows into the human being. Very different kind of creation story. God is transcendent in Genesis 1. Genesis 2, God is imminent and close and near. Now, somebody looked at these two creation stories at some point in time and said, no, we're just going to keep both of them. Now, we might think ancient people were not smart. They're not as smart as we are, so maybe they just didn't recognize that there were differences between these two stories, right? The days actually are different between the two of them, right? The order of creation is different, right? God creates Adam first in Genesis 2, and then creates, nope, not Eve, creates the animals, and then Adam says, no, this isn't good enough, and so God takes Adam, splits Adam in two, and there's a human and man and woman, right? This is different from Genesis 1, right? We'd have to admit that, right? But also it's just a different type of storytelling. It sounds like a folk tale in Genesis 2. Genesis 1 sounds like a liturgy. There's day, there's evening, there's morning, day 1, day 2. Genesis 2 is check this out. There's God's out there farming, and God's kind of creates the human out of clay, right? So this is to say it's a very different style of storytelling. So these are two different creation stories that somebody said, we need both of these, and they put them together. And ancient people did not do this outside of Israel. The Babylonians did not take two different versions of a story and staple them together. The Egyptians did not do this. The Canaanites did not do this. So the ancient Israelites understood what they were doing when they retained two different creation stories at the beginning of the canon. Why would they do this? Because Genesis 1 tells you about a big transcendent God who's far away, kind of amorphous, creates by word. That's a cool image of God, and it helps sometimes. But also you might think, that God's pretty far away. The creator gods of ancient Mesopotamian, Babylonian, Egyptian religion, they aren't close, they aren't near, you can't talk to them. Ptah created the world in Egypt, but Ptah's gone. Right? Who created the world in Greek mythology? Not Zeus. Zeus is the close and near God that you can talk to, but there's this kind of these gods of deep time kind of in the past. So let's say in ancient Israel they said there's a picture of God here that's close and near, informing us by hand. We need that one. Because God is close and near sometimes. Also, we need this image of God that's far away and distant and powerful. Because both of those are somehow true. And so we're going to keep both of these contradictory stories here in the Bible together. I don't know why, but I think it's got a genius to it. There's not one story for God. God's too big for one story. In the same way, in the New Testament, there's 4 different portraits of Jesus. And the early Christians said, too many portraits of Jesus. They disagreed. Luke says something different from John. They all sound kind of different, right? Mark has a different order of events than John does. So let's just condense these into one super gospel. It's called the Gospel Harmony. And actually the most famous, important gospel of the early Christianity was this one called Tatian's Diatessaron. It was like a harmony of all the Gospels, the most common one that we found. But then early Christians said, actually, we're losing something by not having these 4 different stories of Jesus that are slightly different. And Augustine, the theologian, the great theologian, he said, we need all 4 Gospels that are different. We need to admit they're different because it's almost like having stereoscopic vision. Why do you have 2 eyes? You could see with one eye, but you have more depth. You have depth perception with 2 because they're different. Because they're different, it gives you more depth. And Augustine said the 4 different authors of the Gospels that are in your Bible have different points of view, different perspectives, different ways about it. Just like people in my life have different perspectives on me. My kids will tell a very different story from my dean at my school. And that's a good thing, right? But those are different aspects of my life. If you want to understand me, you've got to hear these different stories. And you can't just condense them all into one story, because then you flatten it. So that's the idea here, is that ancient Israel preserved all these different stories, different voices, different perspectives, and we shouldn't flatten them into one voice, one story. I'm flattening a little bit here, but just to say, when you read the Bible, ask yourself, what is the particular lens of this author? What's the particular kind of world assumed by this author? Okay, so basic story, right? As we know, things aren't so peachy in the garden after a while, right? Humans rebel against God. Big issue. We'll talk about sin some other time, but just sin's a big problem, right? People break their relationships with each other and with God. It's the basic idea. And this sin kind of keeps continuing, and God tries to fix it. God tries to fix it by getting rid of all bad people. That's the Noah story. Terrifying if you think about it. God tried to get rid of all bad people, except it didn't work. In Genesis 6, God says, I want to get rid of all the bad people. God sends the flood. In Genesis 9, guess what God says? People just need that. So I'm going to work with them. God changes, not people, at the end of the Noah story. God reacts to people building the Tower of Babel and not kind of tells them, scatters them around, right? God doesn't actually knock down the tower in the story. But God scatters their language and so on. But what God does at the end of this is God says, I got a new plan. I'm not going to fix the whole world at once by doing one big thing like a flood. Instead, I am going to work with one family over a long period of time and accept that they are messed up and yet work with them. And slowly, the blessing will spread. So this is the story, as I see it, that God tells about this world through the Bible. So Genesis 1 tells us that God made a good world, God is committed to it, that people are made in the image of God. Every person you've met is a blessing to this world who's made in the image of God. And yet, people have a lot of problems. You've got them, I've got them, we're well familiar. And God's solution to this problem is the rest of the Bible. And the solution is to slowly work with one family. And that starts in Genesis 12. This is like the big kickoff of the Bible. Genesis 1 through 11 is kind of like the prologue to the Bible. Genesis 12 is the kickoff where God says, go, Abram and Sarah, leave your Mesopotamian house, go to a place that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make you a great nation. You will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. And the very end of this phrase in verse 3, so that the end result of all this stuff that God is doing, so that in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's the result. God is asking Abram and Sarah to leave their home, to try to become different people, so that they can be a blessing to all of the other people in the world. So I tell my students there's two parts to the Bible. You might think Old Testament, New Testament. No, it's Genesis 1 through 11, and then Genesis 12 all the way through Revelation 21. Genesis 1 through 11 is like the creation of the world and then the fall starts. God's other plans didn't work out. Genesis 12 is the same plan as Revelation 21. Jesus didn't change the plan. Jesus is a part of this whole same thing. How? We'll get to that in a little bit. But just to say, this family then encounters all sorts of threats for the rest of Genesis and into Exodus. Pharaoh is a threat. He tries to kill this family, enslave them, keep them from sharing their blessing with the rest of the world. And of course, God ends up defending them and helping them and rescuing them and liberating them and sending them out. And when God sends them out, God brings them to this mountain of Sinai. And when God brings them out across the sea, right? God, the sea parts, right? We've all seen Prince of Egypt, right? So they can walk across the dry land. That's miraculous, but that's actually just the prologue. The salvation is being saved to do something, to continue this work that was started in Genesis 12. God brings them to the mountain of Sinai, and then God says to them in Exodus 19, and to me this is one of the key texts of the whole Bible. God brings them to the mountain in Exodus 19 in the wilderness, and God tells Moses to tell these people, verse 4, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and I brought you to myself. God says, I saved you. Now this is before the law, this is before the covenant, this is grace. God says, I saved you and you didn't deserve it, you didn't do anything to earn it. Many Christians have the idea that Jews have a religion of trying to earn salvation. No Jews ever thought that. It's never been part of Judaism. This is the key. Why are they the covenant people? Because God saved them. Salvation comes first. God saved them first. God saved them from death. Brought them to the mountain. And then says, now that you've seen how I have already saved you by grace, right? I have already saved you by grace. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant. A covenant is really a business deal. No ancient God was known to make a covenant with any people except for Israel. Because gods don't make business deals, right? Zeus didn't make contracts with people. Because Zeus is Zeus. Zeus is a god, right? God gets to do what they want. This is the big deal about being a god, right? Ancient Israel is weird, strange, was made fun of by people because their god signed a contract with their people. How you got married in the ancient world, actually in modern Jewish culture too, you sign a ketubah contract. You sign a wedding contract. This is why the prophets talk about Israel being related to God by marriage, like a wife, right? Like a spouse. That people thought that was weird. Your people married your God is so desperate. Your God married people. Your God signed a contract with the people. They're ridiculous, right? But why would God sign a contract with these people? Because God wanted a relationship. God wanted an actual relationship. That's the point of all this. That God wanted to be in relationship with people, and for people to be in relationship with each other. So God's going to sign this official contract with them, and then try to have them to live it out. To become the kind of people that are going to live in right relationship with each other and with God, so that they can model it
for other nations, so that they can be a blessing to the other nations of the world, and eventually reconnect all of these relationships that have been broken by sin. That's the goal. That's what Exodus 19 is all about. If you obey my voice. Now, Christians look at Jews and say, you're like works-focused, whatever. No, they're not trying to earn salvation by works. They're trying to do the things God's asked them to do to bring blessing to the world, which does require our work. We don't have to do it to be saved. You've already been saved. That's what they said too. We've already been saved from Pharaoh. Salvation came first. But the work is what God is asking us to do to become part of this mission of blessing to all the world. It's a blessing to be a part of this work. So this is the work. Now, if you do this, you shall be a treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine. God says, I love everyone. You're not more special than anyone else. I love everyone. But you will be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. You're going to become the kind of people that can mediate God's blessing to the world like a priest does. You're going to be the mediation of God's blessing and presence to the rest of the world. If you become formed and shaped by these practices of loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. These are countercultural things to say. Like love the vulnerable people in your community. In Exodus, Moses says, love the orphan, the stranger, and the widow. Love vulnerable people. Take care of them like they're your kin. This was radical, strange thing to say in the ancient world, but it was about reconnecting, it's being a blessing to all the different peoples of the world. And that's that covenant. The covenant ultimately is a limited, human embodied, right, contextually limited, culturally limited document. It's written in ancient Hebrew. It's got ancient Hebrew legal ideas in it, like slavery. But God's like, okay, I'll work with you. I'm going to meet you where you are. We'll eventually fix a lot of these things. Let's just start where you are and try to get you to think about other people. And this leads to us. We're going to get to this more next week. But thinking about these complicated ethical problems that we get because we are contextually embodied people. We live in a very different world than ancient Israel did. How do we handle when there's tension between our world and theirs? When people today live a very different way than people in the ancient world, and we might say, well, those ancient practices, like, for example, multiple marriages, right? Men who are married to multiple wives didn't happen the other way in the ancient world, right? Men who are married to multiple wives, like, are they bad for doing that? Are we better? Or should we do it? Or, it's different. It's very different culture, right? So how do we think about relating to these different ancient ethics? We're going to get to that next week. Two stories I'm going to bring up, though. The story of Passover and the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. Some of my favorite characters in the whole Bible. I'm sure yours too, from verse 27. So this story of blessing. God is trying to shape these people into a group. The prophets, here's what the prophets are. The prophets are the people who are messengers of the covenant. They know the covenant, that is, the stuff that God says, be loving and kind to God and be loving and kind to your neighbor, and try to live that out in the world in such a way that you spread this blessing. That's the covenant. These are the people like Isaiah, like Jeremiah, like Ezekiel. They are not primarily fortune tellers. They are not primarily future tellers. They are primarily people who are telling Israel, they are responsible for reminding Israel, or especially powerful people in Israel, about this covenant and about how to embody it in their own lives and in the world. This is the core of ancient Israelite life and theology, right? It's like the prophets are there not to tell people about Jesus primarily. Now, the prophets can be understood to be saying things that are it helps us understand Jesus and that point to Jesus. I told you about the Emmanuel prophecy. This is how prophets work. But they're not primarily talking about Jesus, because that would be ridiculous, right? Imagine if you're like in your house and like the pipes have all exploded and like the water's leaking in, and someone comes in and says, 2,000 years from now, there's a guy's going to come and like take away all your sins. You're like, thanks, wonderful, but do you have a wrench? Can you help? Right? You might not take that person seriously unless their message might help you in some way, right, with your crisis. Right? Okay, so think about the prophets like that. Jeremiah is not primarily showing up to tell them about Jesus. Jeremiah is showing up to tell them about how to live in the midst of a world that's turned upside down. Jeremiah, here's what Jeremiah said. Jeremiah said, so this is about Jesus in a way, but it's not using Jesus' name, and it's not here to kind of be like, it's not primarily pointing to a verse in Luke or something. But tell me if you hear something you know. Jeremiah was told to stand in front of the temple. And at this point in time, the king was in charge of the judicial system, in charge of the economic system. And Jeremiah lived in a world in which many people were falling into debt slavery and were being sold as slaves to other Jews living in Jerusalem. And Jeremiah sees his neighbor fall behind on debt payments and then get taken as a slave, or his children get taken as slaves. And Jeremiah says, this is not great. Jeremiah sees the king of Israel go out and invade other countries and take back their women and children as slaves. And Jeremiah says, I don't know if that's the blessing we're supposed to be bringing to our neighbors. And Jeremiah sees that the king is trying to change the court system to make it so that he can do whatever the king wants all the time and just run roughshod over people who's right. Jeremiah says, I don't know if this is right. So Jeremiah stands up in front of the temple, which is the symbol of God's presence in Jerusalem, the royal city. The temple is the royal chapel, right? Solomon the king built the temple. It's the king's royal chapel. It's like in Washington, D.C., right? It's like the cathedral, the National Cathedral in D.C. Now, if you got up at the pulpit of the National Cathedral and said that the president was going to die, you might get a visit from the Secret Service. Just guessing. Well, Jeremiah gets up in front of the temple and he says, listen to this. The Lord, thus says the Lord. He's a messenger. Thus says the Lord. Like, God said this. Here's what God said. Amend your ways and your doings and let me dwell with you in this place. I want to live here with you. Don't trust these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord. You're not special because the temple's here. The temple's here to try to help you to become special, right? He says, for if you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly with one another, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, if you don't go after other gods to your own hurt, then I will dwell with you in this place. But here you are, trusting in deceptive words to no avail. You're going to steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, go after other gods, and then you're going to stand here in my house that's known by my name and say, we are safe? Like Grace is a get-out-of-jail-free card? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? You heard that part before? You remember that? Is this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers? Who said that? Yeah, that's Jesus, right? Jesus was quoting Jeremiah. Jeremiah wasn't predicting Jesus. Jesus was quoting Jeremiah because Jesus was doing the same thing Jeremiah was doing. That is to say, reminding people about this covenant, which is meant to be a blessing to all the peoples of the world. Accountability to the covenant is what the prophets are all about. And the prophets tell us some stories about the future when God will finally, fully recreate this world and bring together all of these broken relationships into one. But we're not there yet, the prophets tell us. We're on our way. So this big idea about the New Testament, I'm going to end here. The big idea of the New Testament is that Jesus is the culmination, not the replacement of the Old Testament story of blessing. Many Christians think that the Jews failed, and they were trying to earn their salvation, but so then Jesus came and did something totally different that has nothing to do with that Old Testament stuff, and so now you can just print the New Testament Bible and just have it by yourself, and that's, cut out that old Jewish stuff that's bad. No, I don't think any of that's right. I think Jesus doesn't think about himself as changing a lot. Jesus thinks about himself as participating within this same tradition, pointing back to Moses. And Jesus says, well, we got to do some things a little bit differently because of our day and our age. Things have changed. Jesus says, you've heard it said, now I say to you. He changes some things, but when he changes them, he's, I think, trying to say, this is what God has been doing all along, trying to bring blessing to all the peoples of the world through a covenant relationship. That's the story of calling, creation, escape, commissioning, covenant, accountability, recreation. This is the story of the Gospels. Jesus calls the disciples, and he calls 12 of the disciples to recreate Israel, right? And they are all Jews. So that's to say that Jesus is a Jew. He's calling all Jews, right? Paul's a Jew, right? They're all within Judaism, but they're trying to refashion. It's like a renewal movement to try to remember what was core and important about their faith. And this guy, Jesus the Galilean, this is not Jesus really, but this is the reconstruction of the bones of this Galilean guy from right around the area where Jesus lived, sometime around the time of Jesus. So what this guy or his neighbor, some random looking dude, right? We think about Jesus as like tall, blonde, like a long flowing hair, right? The Bible says he was not really anything to look at. That doesn't describe him, right? What we look like, we don't know. But just some dude who's a random guy, right? But also known as the Christ, or the Christos, so the anointed one. He's set aside to be something special for God in the world. He's a normal guy who's set aside to do something special in the world. The people who encountered him said, there's something amazing here, but I'm not going to describe him as being super tall or handsome or anything like that. He's the Christ. He's the anointed one, the one who's going to do something different. And we see Mark 1 and John 1 start with this in the beginning. There's a recreation. They use the same words even that you find in Genesis when it was translated in the Greek. So these guys say, in the beginning, there was a word, right? They start with a new creation story. Mark 1 starts with the beginning as well. And then Jesus calls the disciples. Jesus' passion and resurrection is that moment of salvation that comes before the call in a way, sort of precedes it, at least theologically, right? God saves the Israelites out of the Red Sea here. Jesus saves people on the cross, and then God commissions them, just like they got commissioned at Sinai. Go and make disciples of all the nations. Baptize them, right? And then you get this new covenant, the new community that's baptized by the Spirit in Pentecost, but to go out to all the peoples of the world and speak in their languages. And then we get this view in the New Testament as well about this kind of recreation of the world set to right again. It's the basic story, kind of repeated in a way. And a lot of Christians would imagine that Paul's message, which is the kind of the core theological message of the New Testament, is that Jews are bad and are just wrong, and God's done with them. So instead, we got this new thing. It's called Christianity. It's all about the Gentiles, and they're cool. If we read Paul carefully, instead, what Paul really says is, I'm a Jew. Paul says, I'm a Jew. God is for the Jew. That's God's part of this Jewish community. This is the same community you guys are part of. Paul says, a lot of us are knuckleheads. He said, I'm a knucklehead. It's not that we're better or perfect or something like that, but God's chosen this one family to work through. He's talking to Gentiles when he says, you all don't have to become culturally Jewish to join this community. Jesus has opened a new way for you to join. You don't need to become culturally a part of this family. Instead, you're going to be grafted into, this is his language from Romans 9, Gentiles are grafted into, like a tree, grafted into this tree of Israel. So there's a new path that's been opened up for you to join in with this community of blessing, to bring blessing to all the peoples of the world. That's what Jesus does, according to Paul. And that Jesus provides a new way for us to reconcile with God and with neighbor. So that's the ultimate idea of this story, is that the New Testament is telling us about this new chapter unfolding within this old story that goes all the way back to Genesis 1 and Genesis 12. God is for the blessing of all of the peoples of the earth. We are invited to be a big part of that. What we see in the Bible are individual stories and chapters told by different people at different points in time about how they understood this call on their lives and how they tried to live it out faithfully, and how all of them failed in different ways, like you and I will too. And yet, God loves us and is with us. Okay, so I'll stay around and answer some questions that folks have, but next week we're going to ask this big question, so what? How do we deal with the big differences we see between the ancient world and our modern world about how we live, what's right, what's good? How do you be a blessing to your neighbor? How do you be a blessing to these other nations in a world that's so different and so distinct? See you next week. Thanks, y'all. Peace.